Okay. I now welcome Mr. Justin Walsh from Ernst Young. Is it Ernst Young or Ernst and Young?
Ernst and Young.
Ernst and Young. Thank you. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you?
That's correct, Senator.
For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and capacity in which you appear today?
Yes, Senator. My name is Justin Dennis Walsh. I'm a partner with the firm Ernst and Young.
Thank you. I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of your remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions.
Thank you, Senator. I'll make a very brief statement because I assume the questions will take up some time. Can I just start firstly by thanking the committee for the opportunity to appear here in front of you today. I have read a number of the submissions that have been put to the committee, and as a restructuring professional, I'm certainly grateful for the opportunity to put my opinions and views to the committee for their consideration. I certainly hope that my appearance here today adds some value to the committee, I hope. Secondly, can I just very briefly apologise in advance if I am unable to definitively answer any of your questions today. The matters which I understand you want to talk about relate to a number of files which were finalised a number of years ago. I first received a formal notice that I would be appearing before the committee on Wednesday of this week. Since that time, I have reviewed the statements relevant to the matters which I have been involved with, which have been submitted to the committee, and where my files still exist, because on some occasions they do not, I've tried to review my files in respect of those matters. Those files are voluminous. I've not had the opportunity to review the files in the level of detail which I would like to before appearing in front of this committee. So if I am unable to immediately provide a definitive answer, I apologise, but I'll certainly do my best.
But you can take questions on notice too if you don't want to.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate that. As I said at the start, I'm a partner of the firm Ernst & Young. I know you've had a number of registered liquidators appear before you today. Ernst & Young is a little bit different in that we are a multidisciplinary firm as compared to the others who've appeared. We don't provide only restructuring and insolvency services. We have a wide suite of services, including tax advice, audit, financial modelling, business consulting. So we don't have that reliance on the insolvency market that the other firms do have. Finally, can I just please touch very briefly on the approach that I and my partners at Ernst & Young take towards undertaking insolvency appointments. I think it's fair to say no party enters into a financial arrangement with another party hoping for it to end in receivership. And I think it's important that we remember that the vast, overwhelming majority of borrowers who find themselves in financial trouble find a solution which does not involve receivership. That is because usually there is a better solution. Sadly, for a very, very small percentage of files, receiverships do occur. I have a deep understanding that receiverships are not simply a financial transaction. For those who own the business, a receivership is a tremendously emotional and life-changing event. This is the case for all businesses, but obviously especially in agriculture. As receivers, I think our primary responsibility is to sell the assets over which we are appointed for not less than their market value. I appreciate and acknowledge that for those not deeply involved in the industry, the way we sometimes go about doing that can be a little bit confusing, and I'm happy to talk about that today if it would help. Having said all of that, I'm confident that in all the files that we have undertaken at Ernst & Young, we have discharged our responsibilities appropriately. And I'm happy to talk about any of those files today. I once again thank the committee for the opportunity to appear here, and I'm certainly happy to address any questions you may have for me.
Senator Williams.
Thanks, Mr. Walsh. Thanks for your presence. Yeah, a lot of the complaints the committee have heard of Section 420A receivers not selling at the proper value the farmer considers to be good value or market value. One case I gave earlier on this morning, the committee have seen a valuation of $3.3 million. A few years later, it was sold for about $350,000, $400,000, which is, to me, seems quite outrageous. But anyway, how do we solve that problem? Simple question.
Can I tell you, Senator, it's a really difficult problem, to be honest with you. And I look at my own life. I think my house is worth probably more than what the average man thinks it's worth because I have an emotional attachment to it. I think, and I heard someone mention when the last people up here, people talking about the conflict of interest, and I think one thing about receiverships is I think everybody wants the same thing. The bank wants the farm sold for as much money as possible so they can recover their debt. The borrower wants the farm sold for as much money as possible so that they can hopefully have some money left when it's all done. And the receiver wants the farm sold for as much money as possible because that's how we build our business and get a good reputation. The law is difficult, I must say, because it makes you follow a process. So you must put ads in papers. So I've had examples, for example, in the past where I've been appointed and the next day someone might submit an offer, which I think is attractive, but I have to tell that person, please, sir, can you just cool your engines for a while, because I need to go through a marketing process, because that's what the law and the courts tell me I need to do. I think the other thing is you need to be very, very careful in looking at valuations that are more than a couple of years old, because markets move, in my experience, very quickly. So yeah, I think as a receiver, you need to present the property as best you can. You need to market it as widely as you can, and we have a positive obligation to achieve the market value. Sadly, that doesn't mean we have an obligation to sell it for what the borrower may think it's worth, because that, in reality, may not be the market value.
Yeah, valid point, Mr. Walsh. Yeah, markets do move quickly. They don't move from 3.3 million down to 300,000 or 400,000 for a property.
I don't know the specifics, but that does sound like a big movement.
The committee does have the evidence in camera. That's why I'm not mentioning any names or anything, but I thought it was quite alarming. Your opinion on farm debt mediation Australia-wide?
Look, I support everything that Mr. Cooper said before. Having said that, and I don't know if this is getting off topic, but I think we're all concentrating on what happens when the borrower gets into financial trouble, which is when the mediation would happen. If it were me, I'd much prefer the borrower, if we're going to invest some funds, that we invest it at the outset when the loan is being taken. Because my experience in agricultural receiverships is often the case that there is a farm that has been in a family for many generations and has tremendous, I'm struggling for the word, sentimental psychological value, as you would expect. The borrowers will then encumber that farm to expand for children or whatever other reason they may have, which is a sensible strategy, but I think there is a lack of appreciation of the risk. If you have an unencumbered farm of huge sentimental value, encumbering that with a mortgage to expand is a very risky enterprise.
Sometimes, though, Mr. Walsh, it's a matter of a farmer happily going along, he and his wife going along, and the bank comes to them and says, "You're doing well. Here, take this debt on. Take this debt on." It's piled on them by the banks, and the bank says, "Yeah, you can take care of that." And the farmer says, "No, we can't." "Yeah, you can do it. Take it. Away you go."
Well, I don't have anything to do with that front end, so I probably can't comment.
I didn't mean to
Mr.
stop
Walsh,
you.
the point you just made about the farms being a family of 5 generations, leave it unencumbered. If I had a farm that my great-great-grandfather settled on in Yongler in South Australia, for example, if I had that today, no one to expand it, so I'm not going to mortgage that. If I borrow to buy other farms and don't mortgage the original great-great-grandfather's property, I've still got to write a personal guarantee to repay. Even though it's not mortgaged, they can still come after that original property anyway.
That's true. And I think I'm probably not telling anyone in this room anything. Farming is a difficult business, because in your average business, and I see a lot of business, you can have some degree of certainty about what the cash flows are going to look like going forward. That sadly is not the case, because you can be the best farmer in the world if it doesn't rain for 2 years. That means naught. So it's a difficult enterprise where you have to continually service debt. That's why you've got to look at farming over a period of time, 5 or 10 years. You can't just pluck out 1 year, because the first year you borrow the money, you could get a drought. Therefore, you shouldn't borrow too much or leverage up too much in case you do get the drought first year up, or disease hits, or commodity prices crash, or whatever. So, do you have any solution or recommendation committee about solving this problem where we've seen receivers sell the properties too cheap? To be honest with you, Senator, and there's always going to be isolated examples of people doing the wrong thing. I get that, but in every receivership, certainly that I've ever done, and that almost all that I've seen, when a property is sold, there will be ads in Country Life, the Land newspaper, the Australian Financial Review. The market knows that the property is for sale. Generally, it's a very open process. To me, if it's selling for a very low price, my question is, why has someone, if it's worth much, much more than that, why has someone not taken advantage of the commercial opportunity to acquire the property for more than it's selling for?
Well, probably because it's in drought. It might be grazing property. people don't want to buy it, they're then going to have the mortgage and payments on top of their head. They can't run stock on it because that doesn't have a blade of grass. Perhaps it should be a situation where they actually wait till it rains and get some feed on a property and present it better. Then it'd be a different price.
Well, that's when, if you talk about laws, maybe that's a law, because what the law says now is you must sell it for its market value on the day you sell it, not after a good season. So, it's not always easy. Often the receiver won't have the financial resources to maintain the property for a year or 2 years while he waits for a drought to break. Generally, if it's
What if the banks didn't bring the receivers in and just stuck with the farms until the drought broke? And I know banks have done exactly that.
Yeah, I obviously can't talk for the banks. I'm not a banker, but once the receiver is appointed, my experience generally, although every case is different, but my experience is generally holding assets for a period of years does not usually result in the best return for...
Have you done any receiverships of farm properties yourself?
Oh, many.
When's the last time you've done one?
Well, I must say, some time ago, I'm trying to think of the last one.
Well, that's the point I'm getting at. Have they reduced as time goes on?
Oh, absolutely. There is no doubt the market has changed significantly, and I've been doing
the market or the sentiment or the
sentiment, I suppose. And look, nothing I can say. I can't speak for the banks, but I'll tell you how I read the market. And I've been doing this a long time, nearly 30 years. The banks, I've never seen them more reluctant to appoint receivers to anything, but particularly agriculture. And I've seen, and I think that's a good thing, I've seen some really imaginative solutions which even 5 years ago, 10 years ago would not have been given any consideration. Yeah. And some of the things I'm seeing are things like, well, here's a farm, we're going to take a loss, we being the bank. We can either pay a receiver to do this job, or we can say to the borrower, your equity is zero, but why don't we give you what we'd otherwise give the receiver and you sell the farm? Or those sort of things. There's no prospect that would have happened 4 years ago.
Do you think that's come about because of the change of culture of the banks, because people have woken up to the heavy-handed practices of the banks, and that's why it's kind of changed in the past couple of years?
And I'm obviously biased because I'm a receiver, but I have never, in the time I've been doing this, seen what I consider to be outrageous heavy-handedness, to use your word, by the banks. There's very few receiverships, particularly in agriculture, that I've done in my career where the lack of payments or the financial distress hasn't gone on for a period of at least 12 months before I've got involved. Having said that, to answer your question, I find at the moment my experience is that the banks are more, and this is a good thing, more willing than ever to work cooperatively with borrowers in all spheres, but particularly agriculture.
So why is that? Why have they started working more cooperative with
I don't know the answer to that.
Wouldn't it be a case their reputation has been damaged to some extent? They were probably on an effort now to restore their reputation, surely.
I don't know the answer to that question, but when I say my experience is that they're happy to work with borrowers, that doesn't mean they're happy to, give people free kicks, but they're happy to find cooperative, sensible solutions. While I assume, in my experience, the main aim is to recover their loan funds, which I think is quite reasonable. But there's many ways that can be done. And as I said in my opening statement, very few receiverships. I used to do many agricultural receiverships. I can't, it's years since I've done one, to be honest.
Tell me this, when you've done them, did you ever do a receivership that you went in there, Ernst & Young, you did your thing, the farmers might have left, you looked after the property, you sold the property, the bank paid you your fees, you paid the money after the sales back to the bank, and there was a surplus to the farmer? Have you ever seen a surplus to the farmer?
Oh, absolutely, I have.
Have you?
I must say it's unusual. It's very unusual.
That's what I would have thought.
Which is, very unusual. But I've seen it happen, yes.
Can I say, in general, once the receivers go in now, it's past the point of no return for farmers and there's nothing left for the farmer?
Look, I always have the same discussion, and you can imagine it's not an easy discussion when you turn up as a receiver.
No, it's not.
I always have the same discussion. I say, my job, because it's a balancing act as a receiver between empathy and telling the farmer what they need to know. So I try to be as frank as possible without being rude. But I always say to them, my job now is to sell this farm. And I say to them, having said that, that's going to take 3 or 4 months in a best case scenario. So I say 2 things to them. I say, do you have a lawyer? Because I suspect that you don't understand receiverships like I understand. It's a very unfair discussion. I say, if you want to get your lawyer on the phone, let's have a chat with him now and I'll explain to him. And I say, over the next 4 months, if you'd like me not to sell the farm, you should use that time to come up with some proposal to put to the bank to see their debt retired either in full or in part. And then I wouldn't use these words to the fund, but then it's almost a race. You know, if the sale happens first, it happens first. If an acceptable proposal is put up first, that happens first. But you're right. Once a receiver is involved, it's nearing terminal.
Thanks, Chair.
Senator Hanson?
Thank you. If my voice holds out. Mr Walsh, let me draw your attention to Gwinter Farm. Do you know it?
I recall it, yes.
Story Farm?
Yep.
Okay. Now, you did a report on that?
I did, yes.
Yes? At what time did you do it? You were called in by the banks?
Yeah, was it?
Report on it?
It was 2 or 3 years ago, maybe more, 4.
Yeah, about 2012.
Okay, yep.
Okay, the banks did foreclose on them, wasn't
it? It entered into an insolvency administration, yes.
Correct. And it was, they actually had a loan out. There was around about 3.5 million they had a loan out, and they were seeking a further $500,000 for capital cost into putting more into the development of the farm at that time. So it worked out at $4 million. Here it was at the time. It was quite a profitable farm. It was actually priced at around about valuation of 22 million and did devalue to 12 million. And their debt, I think it was sold for 4.1 million. Mm-hmm. Now, at the time your report here says that Gwinter Farms had reported improved farming went from a negative 1.2 million in 2010, a negative of 682 in 2011, to a positive 1.1 million yield in 2012. So they did increase over the period of time. Mm-hmm. So the farm was producing. The key drivers of increased productivity results had been significantly increased production of strawberries and an increase in market prices achieved. So they were actually increasing, and that's what your report basically says, that they did increase, and their profits were up over over 240%. I think it was increasing at that time.
I'll have to take you on your word, Senator. I can't remember the actual detail, but that sounds about right.
Yeah. I believe that the people paid you for this report $50,000. That was requested by the bank. They signed the cheque over to you, your company, yet you did not give them a copy of this report, and it was only just this year, 5 years later, that they were asked by One Nation for through the banks for a copy of that report. Can I ask why, if they were your client, they paid you the $50,000, why they were not given a copy of this report?
Well, look, I don't remember. Do you mind if I see the report, Senator? Would that be possible? Or?
You can have a brief look at it.
Well, I guess I don't want to read it now, but I'm just interested to know who it's addressed to. My recollection was my client was the bank.
It was actually to Bank West Business.
That's correct.
But they didn't pay for it.
Well, look, I don't have the specifics, but the way it usually works is my client, who I sign an agreement with, is the financier, and then I I would have issued that report to the financier. Before I issued that report to the financier, and this is how it always happens, so I hope it happened on this one, I would issue the report to the borrower, being Gwynter Farms, in draft form, without my opinions in it, to make sure it's factually accurate, because the last thing I want to do is give opinions to my clients based on factual inaccuracies. Now then, once the borrower confirms it's factually accurate, I will send my report to the bank, who is my client.
And who did not hand this report to the people who actually paid for this report for 5 years, because it was detrimental to the bank. Because it showed in your report here, they were a productive farm. They were actually increasing productivity.
Senator, as best I recall, and I may have this wrong, so please correct me, but as best I recall, the report said this, and I have to, this is a rehabilitatable business, and it's not like it recommended to enforce securities or anything like that. And then my recollection of the matter, Senator, is that within a very short time period of me issuing that report to the bank, and we were talking about ways to restructure the business to make it viable, the directors of that company passed a resolution to appoint a voluntary administrator. So I don't think the bank took enforcement action, it was actually the directors of the company.
I'd just say in your report it says, although we consider Bankwest should update its valuations, it would appear that the value of the assets subject to Bankwest securities exceeds the value of its debt.
Correct, but just to be very clear, and maybe I wasn't clear enough in my answer, when you said earlier there was a foreclosure, that's a term that people use to cover all forms of insolvency. And I said yes, but the real issue here is the bank did not take any, in my recollection, the bank did not take any enforcement action against this company. The directors of the company resolved to appoint a registered liquidator as voluntary administrator of that company. There was no action taken by the bank to do that.
Was it your recommendations to foreclose?
Absolutely not. And if I'm happy to point it to you. I'm sure I recommended that there was a rehabilitation plan that could be happening, and then it was the company, Gwynter Farms, who took the action to appoint an insolvency
administrator. That's what I'm picking
administrator.
up in your report, that your report is basically saying they were a viable business.
Correct.
If they could actually, because they were foreclosed on in the May. That was the very start of their productive season, when they could have made a lot of money out of their crops that they put in, but the banks foreclosed on them at that time. And I'm picking up, I haven't read every word for word.
No, it's not a very exciting read, but just to be, lots of numbers, but just to be very clear, Senator, because I think it's very important, I issued to give you the timeline, I issued my report, and what the bank then does with my report is an issue for the bank. I make recommendations, but whether they follow them or not is an issue for the bank. But my understanding is what happened then is I issued my report. While the bank was reading and considering my report, the directors of Gwynter Farm, completely independently of the bank, passed a resolution to appoint a voluntary administrator, and the bank said, well, if you want to appoint a voluntary administrator, it's an issue for you. And then the bank stood back and let the voluntary administrator appointed by Gwynter run with the matter.
I am of the opinion, no, and I'm pretty well informed about this. No, it was the banks that actually did the foreclosure, forced by the bank. It was forced by the bank, not the directors of the company, it was by the bank.
Can you take the question on notice, Mr Walsh, who actually did the appointment of the administrator in that case?
I don't know if Mr. Walsh would take that on.
The owners were actually told they had no other option but to do it, and that was forced by the banks to do it.
Well,
and going on your report here,
I don't know why the owners did it.
they were forced by the banks.
Well, I can't.
Right.
That was something which wouldn't have involved me, Senator. But as you can see, my report was quite clear, I think.
Yeah.
And can I say, just as a
That's why
rule
they
of thumb,
withheld it for 5 years.
I know that you've spoke a lot about what we call investigative accountants reports today. In the 20, more than that, in years I've been doing this, I can count on one hand the number of times I've recommended the bank appoint a receiver. It is usually not the optimum solution, which is why such a small proportion of files ever go into receivership.
Then why do we seem to have hundreds, if not going in thousands across the country? Why are we having this inquiry today if you say it's very few? Then what is wrong with our system then?
As a percentage of the loan books, it's a very small number. And it's becoming smaller and smaller. And basically when people approach me, and say, I've got a problem with the bank, what should I do? I say, go and talk to them, be open, don't get aggressive, find a solution which works for both of you. And 99 times out of 100, that's doable. 1 time out of 100, there might be less than 1 time out of 100, there might be a receivership.
Senator Brock?
Given your national, and I'll get to your international reach a bit later, but given your national reach, do you have a sense that are these problems crop up in certain areas during times of drought? Obviously would be a pressure point. Is it certain lending institutions that seem to trigger more problems than others? Is it can you see a pattern
Sure. Yeah.
through the Ernst & Young network that would give this committee any insight into dealing with the issue?
Yeah, just in respect of agriculture?
Yes.
Look, my experience, and this is counterintuitive and you might find it hard to believe, if you talk about our business, and it's a difficult business, but receiverships, we actually do far less agricultural receiverships during times of drought than times of non-drought, if that's such a word, because my experience of most of the banks is that they don't want to appoint in a drought. I assume, 1, because there's a reputational issue, but 2, it's hard to sell a farm in a period of drought.
Okay.
So
No, fair enough.
my understanding, there's always isolated examples of receiverships which come up because of poor management. That just happens. But if I had to say what I believe to be the biggest driver of agricultural receiverships, it's commodity prices. Definitely commodity prices, I think. In different industries, you've had times in the past where sugar was a very busy industry for people like me, other times when cotton, beef. It's a cyclical, hard business, is farming, as you guys know probably better than me. But I think commodity prices are the biggest predictor.
Just following on from that, and given Ernst & Young's global reach, and I'm happy for you to take this question on notice, I don't expect you to have the answer at your fingertips, is there examples of international best practice in this area that the committee could look at?
I can talk to that briefly, but I'm happy to do more research later. But I think the Australian industry, if I talk years ago, was way behind. If I talk about the UK, for example, or America, and I have never done the study, but anecdotally I know it to be true, there are far less receivership appointments in agriculture now, not 5 years ago, but now in Australia than in the UK or in other jurisdictions. We are seeing far more cooperative, what we call workout solutions, probably because of committees like this, I suppose. And certainly when I speak to my English colleagues, which I don't do that often, but when I do, we're almost leading the way in that now, I think, as a country. But as to actual legislative best practice, I couldn't answer that off the top of my head, I'm sorry.
But look, if you don't think there is, then that's fine. But if you do come across something that you think the committee should take note of,
Sure,
then we'd appreciate it.
I'm happy to do that.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any more questions, Senator Chisholm?
No, all fine.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Doyle's case?
I am, yes.
Okay. I was appalled with what I heard from Mr. and Mrs. Doyle. However, I left all my files in Brisbane, so I haven't got anything with me. So I'm not going to ask any questions. Is there any possibility of potentially asking you questions later?
Yes, yep.
Thank you. I don't know if that'll happen, but when I get back to Brisbane.
Sure.
Just a question on the side. How long does it take to sell a typical cattle property, say, in central or northern Queensland? I know it depends whether it's in drought or
It
conditions.
depends on what the buoyancy of the market. But if I can tell you what I think would be the quickest, and I'd never do it, I would think if I'm a receiver, I'm appointed, it might take me 3 or 4 weeks, best case, to be ready to put it on the market. I then might market it.
Would that be marketing to get it in those 3 or 4 weeks? Or
3 or 4 weeks to get ready, to get marketing material ready, to understand the farm property. This is assuming I don't need to do any rehabilitation work on the property.
Thank you, that's what I was after.
But I may need to do that. It's hard. Every farm is different, but as a rule of thumb, if there's no rehabilitation work to do, maybe 3 weeks to get ready for a marketing campaign, then maybe 6 weeks of advertising and marketing, 2 or 3 weeks of negotiation possibly, and then a sale contract. But it's not unusual to do that marketing and then say, no, none of the offers, which happened on Doyle, because I read the file on the plane on the way down. We did a whole marketing campaign on that particular file, and at the end of it, I've just read a letter before that I sent to the bank saying, I don't have any acceptable offers yet. We're going to need a few more weeks. So it's not like you can just say, here's the timeline and we're sticking to it. It doesn't work that way.
No, but typically, or what's the range? 2.5 years to sell a property?
No, very few. Look, very few would take that long. Very few.
Okay.
In fact,
6 months,
6 months.
typically?
Yep. Because
Okay.
you need to, as you know, I'm sure, receiverships are expensive. And the quicker you can get them done without compromising asset value, it's a balance, the better for everybody.
Yeah. So what about a farm that's not in receivership? A farm that's going along happily, how long would it take to sell one of them? Again, the same thing. Could be instantly, it could be 2.5 years.
It depends on how keen the borrower is to sell,
Okay.
I suppose.
Yeah, okay. I thought it was a dumb question.
I didn't say that, Senator.
No, I did. I did. No, make that clear. I said it was a dumb question.
So I just want to ask, then would you see it unreasonable for a property be in receivership for 3 years at a cost of $1 million a year?
Unreasonable. Look, it's hard to comment, Senator, without knowing the detail. I would think it's an issue which would need explanation. There may be a logical explanation, but
What about to count some sheep and it cost $10,000 that they had to pay to the receiver to count some sheep on their property? Yeah.
It's very hard. Look, receiverships, I think, are the sort of things which, when you look back at them, there's many, many things that you can look back and say, that's something which should have been done a different way. Hindsight is
No, not been done a different way. The cost is exorbitant, it's over the top, it's ridiculous. Now, you explain to me, how can we change that so it is a reasonable cost to the people who are going through the stresses that they are? This has to be regulated some way. It is out of the ballpark. So what do we do?
Well, I mean, as a receiver,
You've got
Senator...
carte blanche.
Sorry?
You people, you know, like, I know, I'm not going to say you, okay? But people who are the liquidators who are going into these properties have carte blanche over it. You are charging these exorbitant costs that is ridiculous, over the top, and it's destroying people in their lives. If they were just left with the debt, they could probably pull themselves out of it. But by the time the liquidators go in, and they're actually charging from $150 plus, you know, up to $650, $700 with GST, we can't forget the GST, all that money, plus not one, if you've got multiple that, we're looking at the high cost of nearly $6,000 a day that they are charging. That is just over the top. So what we do, how do we rein this in? Or have you just got this market out there and you charge whatever you want to and there's no competition? Should it be regulated that it has to be reined in?
Well, it's a wide-ranging question, but let me tell you, I think it's one of the more... It's a tremendously competitive market, is the answer. Now, it's a very difficult and costly process to do a receivership. I understand that. And I understand, Senator, when you say $600 an hour is outrageous, but you need to understand the law around being a registered liquidator is you need to be a chartered accountant or a CPA or something like that. If you go to a tax chartered accountant or a tax CPA, you're paying them significantly more than that amount of money.
We're talking 8 hours a day in, day out, week after week. You're not using your brains that much.
I don't know how to respond, Senator. You say, how can it be fixed? I know there's other jurisdictions in the world where they have government departments that do all the insolvencies. Maybe that's a solution. I don't know.
I think because there's no competition, I think you're a click group and you just charge what you want to, and that's what happens. And I think it needs to be regulated. It needs to be a price that needs to be set on it, because these people are just destitute. And I feel for these people, and I hear what you say, that people have not been business-minded in their practices, and, okay, foreclosure, but I think there's a lot of problems right across the board, but I've got to consider those people, foreclosure on a property, and then they're up for another $1 million a year for 3 years? Come on, that's just not reasonable to me.
Can I say, and Senator, you obviously will approach it how you wish, but I don't think you can paint the whole industry with the one brush. I'm not sure I've ever done a farming receivership that lasted 3 years, and I can tell you if I did, I think my business would go pretty poorly going forward. I don't know if there's an explanation for a 3-year receivership, but as I said to you, to me it sounds like an issue which needs an explanation.
Yeah, thank you.
What are the main forms of ownership structures in the rural sector? There's sole proprietor?
Yep.
Partnership? Corporate? Anything else?
They're the
Managed
majority.
investment?
There is the odd managed investment scheme, and I saw there was a submission about a file I was involved in there, but they're these days few and far between.
You were involved in the early days, I think. Someone else took it over, didn't they?
That's right, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yep.
So just those four?
There's
trusts?
some are owned by trustees in their capacity as trust, but I find generally, unless you're at the really big end of town, the structures are quite simple. And Senator, and I don't want to talk about the last person, you raised the point that above $5 million they get sophisticated. My experience is you can have $20, $25 million loans where the borrowers are pretty unsophisticated, and I don't say that in an insulting way, but with a lack of understanding around the laws around what we're doing. So I don't think you can have a approach that big debt means sophisticated borrower, particularly in agriculture, because it's not their skill set.
What are the forms of insolvency practice or recovering of a business when it comes to each of those structures? So the sole proprietor, what is that called?
Look, generally, if it's a bank, the banks will appoint a receiver, whether it's a sole
So
proprietor
that's a family business or
a company. It doesn't matter if they're appointing under their securities. Then you've got things like, as we had in the file that Senator Hanson mentioned, a voluntary administrator which can be appointed by the board of a company but not by an individual.
Thank you.
Or if it's a partnership or an individual, then often you may have bankruptcy trustees.
Sorry, I missed that.
If it's a partnership or an individual, you might have bankruptcy trustees. But for corporations or individuals, appointments made under mortgages are generally receiverships. For corporations, you can also then have voluntary administrators or liquidators, and for individuals, you can have bankruptcy trustees.
Okay, thank you. With a family business, I think Senator Williams has asked this question a number of times. It's attractive to me. Should a receiver just go in and replace? Well, you've got a corporate ownership, say, and
Yep.
you've also got individual ownership or a family ownership
Yes.
of a farm.
Yep.
And you go in as a receiver. With the corporate, you would just manage through the corporation.
Yep.
With the family business, you might manage with the family, leave the family in place and just help them, or
Yep.
you might kick them off the land.
Yes. Yep. Well,
Would it be?
so my approach is always, and although I do a lot of agricultural receivership, Senator, I'm not a farmer. In almost every case, the person on the farm when I get there has a better understanding of that farm than I can ever hope to have. So the best solution is to keep them there. Now, some of the firms you will have heard of today have a bit of a different approach, heard from this morning, have a different approach to me in that they'll have agricultural consultants on their payroll. I take a different approach. I like to get local, because it's a big country, you need to understand the geography you're working in. I like to get local vets, local agronomists. I think A, it gives a better solution. B, it gives a better, more cost-effective solution because of the $600 an hour. To me, that's a better solution. But always, unless there is and sometimes this happens, unless there is a major breakdown in our relationship, the farmers who are working the property before I get there will be asked to stay. Sometimes they're not prepared to, that's their prerogative. But generally, we would like to keep them there if we could.
Okay. On what grounds do you enter a property? If you were coming in to march a farmer off her land, what would you need before you would do that?
Can I say I'd never use the terminology march them off, but
Evict them.
as a receiver, I would arrive. I have the power to be in control of the property.
Who gives you that power?
or it's under the mortgage, let's say it's owned by a company and the family live on the property, technically they have a tenancy granted to them from the company to live there. Now, I, as the receiver of the corporation, have the right, depending on, I then need to find out the terms of the lease they have with the company. Almost always in farming, it's an oral lease. Now, generally, if I needed possession, I wouldn't turn up there and say, please can you leave tomorrow? I would say, look, we need to work through this. Ultimately, we're going to need vacant possession. It's going to take 4 months, 5 months, 6 months to sell this property.
So you need vacant possession so you can sell it?
Yes.
Or is that why you need it? I'm
Correct.
ignorant
Yes.
of these things. That's
Yeah,
all.
so the perfect solution, if everyone's cooperating and we're working together well, is I would say, can you please stay here till it's sold? A, because they know about the property. B, it offers security, because people vandalise things when receivers get involved. But clearly no one, or very rarely, are people wanting to buy a farm if the existing family are going to stay on there after they buy it. So generally we like to just aim to have vacant possession on the day a sale might complete.
Okay.
Are all receivers as caring as what you are?
Look, Senator Hanson, I think there is some empathy there. I mean, it's not easy to, whether it's agriculture or not, it's not easy to have a business.
I'm sure it's not. Look, I'm probably a little bit sarcastic there in the way I said that, because I've heard from so many people that, when receivers come in, I'm just gobsmacked to think that if you're going to go in there and you're going to talk and you in such a nice way that you're going to explain to the people, at what point, why do receivers roll up with 4 or 5 police in tow? Why do they call the police?
I've never done that, Senator. But
No, well, you
sometimes,
haven't. Well, see,
that's one example I have. Sometimes, if you have forewarning that there's lots of guns and the borrower is very angry, as happens, and clearly you need to be safe. But my experience is, am I empathetic? Yes. But also, in addition to that, the best solutions are achieved with cooperation. And these people, just because... can I tell you, the reason I got into insolvency originally is because I helped a family member through an insolvency and found it interesting. So these people have not committed a crime. They have not murdered someone. They've just run out of money. But going in receivership is not a punishment. It's just something which is a sad part of life.
Do you think that the people, now you've got your knowledge, experience, your background, you're thrown in there, and all of a sudden these people are faced with receivers coming in, we're going to take over your property, you've got to get your possessions out of here in the next half an hour, we want you gone off the property. Is there enough, do you feel that there is enough time to work with the people to forewarn them, to give them, because it's a hell of a shock to them. They have no idea
Absolutely.
what the hell is happening in their life.
Absolutely. And to answer your question, Senator, can I say no receiver has the power to ask someone to leave a property within an hour? And if
No
any
receiver has that authority?
Well, if you have a tenancy, you need to give reasonable notice. You can't give an hour's notice.
I've read reports here where they've been given half an hour to pick up your personal
Well, I'd have to know the
possessions and leave.
specifics, but can I say it's a really hard one,
So
Senator?
that's unlawful.
We have
You're
people in
telling
the
me
room
that's
with 2 hours'
unlawful.
notice.
Well, I shouldn't say I need to know the specifics,
Yeah.
but certainly I've never done it. And if you're living on a property owned by a company, you have a tenancy. But can I say it's a really hard one because, like everything, you hope for the best and plan for the worst. And unfortunately, and it's a very small minority, there are a very small minority of people, if you say, look, get ready because there's going to be a receivership next week, bad things happen on the farm property and they say, well, I just want to destroy the house because there's nothing in it for me now, it's the farm. Very few do that, but you just don't know. You don't know as a receiver. I find the best approach, which I think is an awful approach, but I think it's the best approach, is to go to the farm in person and say, can I please speak to you? I'm the receiver. I could send them a text, I could send them an email, I could ring them on the phone and say I'm the receiver, but I think the best of all the bad options is to sit down, and I always say the same thing. I'm the receiver, can you please, if you want to, ring your lawyer because they'll understand this, and do you want to have a cup of tea and we talk about it? Sometimes I get thrown out and said I wouldn't have a cup of tea with you if you were the last man on earth. Sometimes they sit down and want to have a chat. There's a wide, but it's a tremendous shock. You can never accomplish too much on the first day of a receivership because people are in shock.
when a receiver goes in and these people still have the bills coming in, like their electricity, the rates and bills that are coming in, they're not paid and they don't know it's not been paid, and yet what's the case there? What happens there? Why aren't these rates and bills
Do you mean the
paid?
electricity for the farm property?
Yeah, for the property,
Well,
yes.
As receiver, I would be personally liable to pay that. So it would be, I have a personal liability, not the bank, me personally.
I know of cases where it hasn't been paid and actually they've got a bad name around town because people have saying because they hadn't paid it.
Can I say, and it's one of the
Receivership.
explanations for the high cost, Senator, because there's a lot of risk in it. So when I walk in and say I am the receiver, everything that happens on that farm from that day forward, I'm personally liable for. So if a big load of grain comes to feed some cattle, I am personally liable to pay for that grain. If someone falls down a hole and injures themselves and the occupational health and safety wasn't done properly, I'm personally liable for the consequences.
So how is it a risk? When at the end, when a farm or a business or something gets sold, the receivers are the first to be paid by the banks. So how are you taking on any risk?
Well, as an example, Senator,
You're the first creditor to be paid.
yeah, but it's not just about that sort of risk. And as you can imagine, farms are often dangerous places. People get injured. If someone gets run over by a tractor, you can bet your life who they're going to be.
Well, how many people have been run over a tractor under a farm that you've had under a receivership?
Oh, I've had a number of people injured. I had a partner in Melbourne who's no longer with our firm, but someone was injured in a factory. But it's all stuff that we need to manage at the outset.
And I understand that it needs to be managed, but at the end of the day, the creditors, the first creditors to be paid when a farm or a business is sold are you guys. So I can't see that being a risk.
Oh, well, we'll have to disagree.
Financially, that is, financially. Because at the end of the day, your bill is going to get paid. Is that correct?
Oh, I do many insolvencies where I'm not paid. Many. So, for example, if I'm point of the liquidator, I might find that a company is assetless and you still have to do the work because you're required to by law and you don't get paid. Don't get me wrong, I'm not crying poor, but that is how the industry works.
Well, that's how most industries work. I've done,
Yeah,
before
I'm
I
not
became a senator, I
suggesting-
was an electrician. I've done many jobs that I've never got paid. I'm still waiting to be paid for 10 years down the track.
Yeah, no, I'm not suggesting that it's unique to this industry.
So, coming back, on what grounds would you enter a property? In other words, what documents would you insist on seeing from the bank?
I'd like to see the bank's mortgage.
So that'll tell you whether or not they've got the power
right to appoint a receiver.
Okay.
I'd like to confirm that the borrower is in default of their loan agreement, because if there's no default, the bank will not have a power to appoint a receiver.
So what would be proof for you in that case?
Look, in 99 times out of 100, the default is always the same one, and that says loan payments that have been missed. And generally in agriculture, they've been being missed for over a year.
This is not having a go at you, but
Yep.
I just want to let you know that in your industry, some people have never defaulted on payments, and yet they've been...
It does happen. There's no doubt it happens. Yep.
On what grounds would it happen then? Just in your experience of the industry. And when I'm not grilling you...
No.
Because you're the last one here.
It feels a little bit like it, but
because I haven't asked these questions yet.
And I'm not a lawyer, but I'll give you my bush. Someone else used the term.
Well, I
lawyer.
like the way you've handled yourself so far. That's one of the reasons why I'm asking you.
Thank you. The bank's documents will generally say, here's all the defaults. And one of them might be, for example, you need to have what we call an LVR, loan to value ratio of 70%. So, i.e., the value of your loan must be no more than 70% of the value of the asset subject to our security, which might be the farm. If a valuer comes and says it's not worth 70%, that is a default. Having said that, my experience, certainly now, but always, but even more so now, is banks are very reluctant to use that sort of default to appoint a receiver.
But they could.
They could.
They could legally.
They could.
And you could then do that.
Yes.
Even though what you would really want is a default on interest payments or loan repayments.
Principal or interest, yes. And certainly today, I'm not aware of any receiverships happening today that there's not a principal and interest payment default. But there is the power for other defaults. And what are those defaults? You need to read the loan agreements to work out exactly what they are, but that's a common one, the LVR default.
And I understand the banks are now, through the Australian Bank Code, they're now looking at not defaulting people for things other than interest or loan repayments.
There's a lot
Considering that.
Well, to be honest, whether they make that code or not, that to me is it's becoming industry practice. To me, unless the asset is in threat. So, sometimes, very rarely, once again, you have borrowers who just behave irrationally. People have mental illness or whatever, very rarely, but that might give cause to a concern that the asset is in peril. And I think in those circumstances, the banks also might elect to appoint a receiver. But one thing I don't do, thank goodness, because it's the hardest part of the whole process, is make the decision to appoint a receiver. That's the hard decision made by the banks.
Okay, so are receivers shown the customer's default notice?
Generally, yes. There'll be an acceleration or a demand. Yes.
So you would assess that, and if the bank wasn't doing something lawfully?
That's an interesting one. I heard you. As a receiver, I would not take a direction from a bank. And to be honest with you, that can be, or any financier. Whether I sell an asset, it is my decision. The way I market an asset, it is my decision. I'd usually take input from the buyer, and I'd probably take input from the bank, but not the buyer, the borrower. But ultimately, it is my decision. And if the bank seeks to impose a view on me that I don't agree with, I wouldn't do it. And in the past, I have lost jobs because and it's not that the financier wants me to do something illegal, and I think it's just that we have a different of opinion about what is the best way to do something. And if that is the case, I will say, no, I'm not doing that. And you may or may not believe me, but my experience is most banks respect that.
Okay, so there would be some banks, and we're aware of this anyway, that would try and foreclose someone illegally, and a receiver might not stand up to the bank and just go ahead anyway.
Oh,
potentially.
It'd be a silly receiver because if there is no default, and once again, it's a legal question, but I'll give you my view. If the bank doesn't have the right to appoint and they appoint, I am trespassing.
Right.
I.e. criminally.
Right.
So the bank can't say, don't worry, we'll look after you financially for trespassing, because it's more than that. So
encouraging you to break the law.
It would be a very silly receiver to accept an appointment where they knew there was no default.
Okay. Do receivers conduct due diligence in regard to ensuring that financiers enforcing receivership process by evoking the alleged power of attorney is actually valid for the financiers to do so? I'm guessing the answer is you would check, because you've already said you check the mortgage agreement, and that indicates power of attorney.
Yeah, to be honest, I know it's there, but I can't recall any examples of the bank using a power of attorney granted to it by a borrower. I can't recall an example.
Okay,
I'm not saying it hasn't never happened.
We've heard of some.
Yeah, but none that I've been associated with.
Okay. Any more questions, Senator Chisholm? Senator Giorgio?
I've got one more. So you said earlier that you were in this business for about 25 years or so. Now, being quite a large company, in your best knowledge, do you think there's certain receivers out there, in any industry, who aren't doing the right thing? And this is one of the reasons we have, we have all these complaints about them, who aren't doing the right thing, who need to be looked at, and some parts of the industry need to be cleaned up. And if so, how can it be done? How can we kind of clean up this industry?
Can I give you a two-pronged answer to that question? And I don't want to. The two-pronged question to that question is: there's not a receiver I know in the world that there's not someone out there who thinks that guy's done the wrong thing. No, I'm going to get to the second part. Okay, but so you need to be careful. And I'm not looking for sympathy, but it's a very hard way to make a living. You almost can't do it without annoying people some of the way. And you can do what's called a voluntary administration, which is where the borrower appoints you. And I generally say to the borrower, you appoint me, but I guarantee you we're going to have some massive blow-ups on the way, because I'll have a different view. So people will think maybe you're doing the wrong thing when I might think you're not. But to answer your question, I think like any industry, anywhere, there are people doing the wrong thing. No doubt in my mind, but every industry is like that. Having said that, I think it's very well regulated. And I think most people do not do the wrong thing because it's a very short-term career move because it's quite a small industry and people will quickly find out. I think it's heavily regulated, and I think if you're doing the wrong thing, you don't last very long.
One more question, because I'm aware that Senator Brockman needs to go. The first witness we had this morning said that there are competitive pressures on receivers. What are the competitive pressures in your industry, so we understand your industry?
Well, if you're just talking about receiverships, I think there's two major areas of competition from the banks. So we, like any business, we talk to our customers and we, for example, I think the first person today was Ferrier Hodgson, who are a very good firm. I'm sure that they talk to financiers and say that they're the best receivership firm, and I talk to financiers and say I'm the best receivership firm. The pressures to me are banks wanting people with deep industry knowledge, and I think that's a great pressure for borrowers, because if you understand the industry, you're going to get a better outcome. And I think that's a big change I've seen in my career, that banks are more and more looking for people, maybe not the actual receiver, but at least he can surround himself with industry experts. The other big competitive pressure, which has really ramped up in recent times, is around cost. Banks are more and more looking for competitive pricing, so might against a competitor. Certainly, cost is a major area of competition nowadays.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walsh.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Senators.
your candour.
I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
And now, that concludes today's proceedings. I thank all the witnesses who have given evidence to the committee today. Thanks also to Broadcasting, Hansard and the Secretariat. I declare the hearing adjourned.